This week had two interesting days back to back. One was October 21, 2015, which some of you might know was the Back to the Future Day from the movie Back to the Future. But October 22, 2015 was Back to the Past Day for me, as I thought about the day of the great disappointment. I've often thought it was interesting that we call October 22, 1844 the day of the great disappointment. In actual fact, October 22, 1844 was the day of the great hope. October 23 was the day of the great disappointment. Because their hopes were great and fantastic on October 22. And this week we remembered the 171st time that great disappointment. Some of you remembered it, some of you didn't. For me, it's a very interesting day because I have positive thoughts but also negative thoughts. How do you feel? You know, in some ways it's a very positive day, but it is a great disappointment, and it's hard to feel positive about a disappointment. Many years ago, my wife and I went to New York to the William Miller farm and visited it. It was in the fall. It was in September, and the leaves had just started turning. And we went up to the farm and toured the farmhouse. I remember it very well. Then we went out back and went through the maple grove and then out to what's called Ascension Rocks. It's where William Miller and his family and other believers waited, starting the morning of October 22 and through the day, waiting for Jesus to come. While we were there, my wife and I had completely opposite reactions to the place. While I was there, I was inspired. I was excited. I was at a place where history was made. I was at a place where people who loved Jesus were waiting for his coming. To me, it was inspiring. But my wife found it to be one of the saddest places she's ever been in her life. And she couldn't help but feel that sadness, which probably tells you a little bit about both my wife and me, how we view life. She was in tune with that great disappointment. And so for me, also, October 22 will always be the day of the great disappointment. Many years ago when I was pastoring in Ohio, I had a secretary who announced to me one day that she was going to be getting married. Now, she was an older woman, and she had been married twice before, and this would be her third marriage. And so I said, "Oh, cool. When you're getting married?" And she said, "October 22. I wanted to say it, but I didn't say it. What I wanted to say was, "Oh, I wonder which one of you will be disappointed." That's what I wanted to say. My wife says I'm just as bad. Even if I didn't say it, I was just as bad for thinking it. It's a natural response. October 22, the day of the great disappointment. Notice that I didn't say we celebrated the anniversary this week, because it was a great disappointment. But it's good for us to remember. And it has this schizophrenic view. Yes, it's a reminder that Jesus has not come yet. But it is a reminder that Jesus is going to come. Amen. It's a reminder to us that Jesus has not come yet, but it's also a reminder to Jesus that he hasn't come yet. And as badly as we want him to come, he wants to come even worse, I believe. And so we have this anniversary. William Miller. It's interesting that planning this service today, I did not know that they were going to sing that song until about a week ago, and I had already planned this sermon. So the Lord had a way of dovetailing this together. William Miller was the first to come to the idea that Jesus was going to come on October 22, 1844. Actually, I've misstated that. He was the first one to come to the idea that Jesus was going to come at the end of the 2,300 days. You'll see why in just a second. I misstated it. William Miller was a deist. He didn't necessarily believe the Bible, but he did believe that there was a higher being, but he didn't really care about us. And so William Miller had a lot of Christian friends who wanted him to be a Christian, and so he decided that he would study the Bible to see if the Bible really was true or full of inconsistencies as he believed. He started out studying his Bible at Genesis 1, verse 1. He laid aside all commentaries. He had only Cruden's Concordance, which would allow him, when he didn't understand a word or a concept, to look up all the verses of the Bible. It was not exhaustive, but it had most of them. It would allow him to do some very deep Bible study. And so he started at Genesis 1:1 and began to study, expecting to find all kinds of errors. And this is what he says about his study. He says, "It became my delight." What a wonderful thing. It became my delight. And he says, best of all, he found Jesus as his best friend and Savior, and found the promise of his second coming. He worked his way through about half the Old Testament or more, and finally came to that verse in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, that would change the direction of his life. Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, he read this. This is a holy one speaking to Daniel about a vision. Verse 14, it says, "And he said to me, Daniel, for 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." William Miller wondered what in the world this was. It's a time prophecy, and what is the cleansing of the sanctuary? And so he began to do his study on what could this prophecy possibly mean. He studied it intently. He writes he studied it all day and he studied it all night. One has to wonder how Mrs. Miller felt about this. But he intently studied it, and he came to some conclusions. He concluded that the 2,300 days equaled 2,300 years, using a principle called the day-year principle. A day in prophecy equals a year of actual time. Was he right? Yes, he was. I believe he was. He concluded that the beginning of the 2,300-day prophecy was the same beginning date as in Daniel 9, something called the 70-week prophecy. He concluded that at the same time period was covered at the beginning by Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. And he came to this verse in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. It says, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And it continues on explaining the 70-week prophecy. But he concluded that the beginning period of the 70-week prophecy and the 2,300-day prophecy was the same beginning. And he looked into history and found this command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. He found out that it happened in the year 457 BC. So he did the arithmetic. He also concluded, by the way, was he right? Yes, he was. The time periods do begin at the same time. Further, he concluded that the cleansing of the sanctuary was the second coming of Jesus and the cleansing of the earth by fire. Was he right? No, he wasn't. This is where he made his major error. He didn't understand that there was a heavenly sanctuary, which we read about in the book of Hebrews. He did not understand that nowhere in Scripture is the earth ever spoken of as the sanctuary. So this was his error. Well, he did his arithmetic, and he came to this startling conclusion. He says this: he concluded that Jesus was coming back to this earth about the year 1843. About the year 1843. And since he's writing sometime around 1820 or so, he writes that in just 25 years, all the present affairs of this present state would be wound up. 25 years, and the earth would end. Now, what would he do with this message? He was very hesitant to share it. He was plagued with doubts. He wanted to study it out. What if he was wrong? So he continued to study it for about 12 more years. Half the time that the earth had left, he continued to study it. Until finally in August 1831, something important happened in his call to ministry. In August of 1831, he had the feeling that he had to do something. And he had this ringing in his ears: go, tell it to the world. I have appointed you a watchman. Go, tell it to the world. And William Miller kept feeling like God was pushing him to preach what he had learned. And he said to God, I cannot preach. I cannot preach. And the message kept coming to him: go, tell it to the world. And he was under great burden until finally he made a covenant with God. He said, okay, God, I'll tell you what. If you will give me an opportunity to preach, I'll do it. And he finished his prayer, and he felt pretty good about himself. He felt at peace, not believing that anyone would give a 50-year-old minister from the boonies in New York an opportunity to preach. He thought he had settled it. About 30 minutes later, there's a knock on his front door. Absent-mindedly, not even thinking about his promise to the Lord, he goes to the door and finds out it is his nephew Irving, who lives, by the way, 16 miles away. This is an important detail. 16 miles away. And he greets his nephew and says, what are you doing so far away from home so early in the morning? And his nephew says, well, I left before breakfast. Father sent me to tell you that the Baptist minister in Dresden will not be able to preach tomorrow. Will you come? Will you tell us what you've been studying about the second coming? Now think about this for just a second. 30 minutes after he made this covenant, how long does it take to walk 16 miles? Not 30 minutes. God had sent the answer to his prayer of covenant hours before he even prayed it. Well, he didn't give up that easily. The story is that William Miller went out into the maple grove behind the house. And he paced up and down, talking with God and pleading with God to relieve him of this covenant, relieve him of this duty to go and tell it to the world. Till finally, he submitted to God. And there's a report that his wife and his daughter looked out to the backyard, back to the maple grove where William Miller had been pacing and talking with God. And very uncharacteristically, he was doing a little jig, dancing around like finally the burden had been lifted and he has submitted to God. That afternoon, he packed himself and took the horse off and went to Dresden. He came home, and in the mail waiting for him when he came home was another invitation to preach, which had been sent days or weeks before. Don't make a covenant with God unless you're willing to follow through with it. That's the point of this story. He began preaching in other places. He began preaching to large crowds in the large cities. Tens of thousands of people heard William Miller preach. He never did actually set the date of October 22, 1844. He said that Jesus would come sometime around the year 1843. That's as exacting as William Miller really ever got. William Miller didn't understand or didn't take into account that a timeline is different than a number line. And so on a timeline, you have a place for zero. Some of you who are math majors understand what I'm saying. But on a number line, you have a zero. But on a timeline, you don't have a zero. There is no year zero. And so 2,300 years from 457 BC actually takes one to 1844. It was another preacher whose name was S.S. Snow who came up with the date of October 22. He did it because of the phrase, the cleansing of the sanctuary. He said that the cleansing of the sanctuary was done on the Jewish Day of Atonement. When you look at the Old Testament, what the priest did, the cleansing of the sanctuary was on the Day of Atonement. And in 1844, the Jewish Day of Atonement was on October 22. And so he believed, and I believe rightfully so, that God would choose to make the fulfillment in line with the type or with the Old Testament sanctuary. And so October 22, 1844 was the date. On that day, they didn't keep membership rolls of the various Advent believers. So we don't know exactly how many there were, but probably more than 50,000 and maybe up to 100,000 people woke up on the morning of October 22, 1844, with the blessed hope in their hearts. But they closed the day with tears in their eyes. It was a Tuesday. In northern New England, the weather was beautiful. How do we know? Well, because 3 days afterwards, on October 25, 1844, the local newspaper, the Eastern Argus, reports this. The weather is most delightful in this nook of the world. Our friends, the Millerites, are surprised that we have any weather at all at this late date. You see, they began making fun of the Millerites from the very beginning. But this was supposed to be the day, October 22, the day that all their hopes and dreams came true, the day Jesus would come, the day that those who had fallen asleep in love with Jesus would be resurrected. One of them was a preacher named Charles Fitch. Charles Fitch was 38 years old. He had 6 children. He was a very active Adventist preacher. And in the weeks before the great disappointment of October 22, he had been out preaching many times, and various people had decided that they wanted to be baptized. And in northern New England in October, it can sometimes be chilly. And so Charles Fitch went out 3 times to baptize groups of converts in cool weather and in cold water. That exposure led him to fall ill, and only 8 days before October 22, he died. October 14. The periodical, the Midnight Cry, a Millerite paper, reported that, quotes, his widow and fatherless children are now at Cleveland, confidently expecting the coming of our Lord to gather the scattered members of the family. It says, Sister Fitch is smiling and happy. Why wouldn't she be? Her husband had died, but in 8 days, she'd see him. In 8 days, the children would have their father back. and they'd be at home with Jesus. The great disappointment was not just a disappointment that Jesus didn't come. It had many levels. October 22 was the day they would cease to need their earthly belongings. And so many of them had sold or given away their stuff because they would no longer need it. The crops were left in the field. Joseph Bates, one of the leaders, on February 6th, sold his property for $4,500. He paid off all of his debts and used every single bit of the money that was left to support the cause of the preaching of the second Advent. His neighbors tried to buy some potatoes that he had still in the field. About a week before the great disappointment, October 22. They tried to buy them, but he wouldn't sell them. He said that he would not be right to sell them when I know that you will not receive benefit from them. I mean, why would I sell them to you and take your money when they're going to burn, and by the way, you are too? But he didn't say that. But why would he do that? Why would he take their money? They were going to burn up. October 22, the day predicted, they believed, in Daniel 8:14, the day of the cleansing of the sanctuary, the day of the end of the world, the day of the great hope, only to be followed by the day of the great disappointment. Hiram Edson was one of those who were looking for the coming of Jesus. He writes this very poignant story. He says, "We confidently expected to see Jesus Christ and all the holy angels with him, and that his voice would call up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the ancient worthies and near and dear friends who have been torn from us by death. Our expectations were raised high, and thus we looked for our coming Lord until the clock tolled 12 at midnight." He says, when he knew that the day had passed, their disappointment became a certainty. He says, our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came upon us as I have never experienced before. We wept and wept till the day dawned. I don't think I've ever experienced a disappointment like that. Never experienced my hopes and dreams being dashed like that. All hope, Joseph Bates wrote, all hope sunk and courage died. Not only that, how do you think people treated these Millerite believers the day after the great disappointment? Joseph Bates told a story about the fact that they had nothing in the house because they expected to be gone. October 22. They had bought nothing. They had no provisions. And so on the morning of October 23, even though they had just a few pennies left, Joseph Bates had left the house and gone to the local store to buy some flour and other items for his family. And he writes this, the boys of the street followed and hooted after me, and men pointed the finger of scorn at me, saying, I thought you were going up yesterday. You have no idea of the feeling that seized me. I had been a respected citizen and had with much confidence exhorted the people to be ready for the expected change. With these taunts thrown at me, if the earth could have opened and swallowed me up, it would have been sweetness compared to the distress I felt. Great. To even just say great disappointment almost sounds too trite. And probably this was made even worse because of something that happened in Joseph Bates' own home just a couple days before. on October 21, the day before the expected coming of Jesus, Bates's teenage son, who was 14 years old, had left his mother and father's home and had joined on as a mate on a boat bound out of harbor, rejecting his parents, rejecting the message. How painful. More painful to calculate, more hurt calculated to hurt his father. What was the aftermath? The disappointment was there. What would happen? Well, thousands repudiated the belief. They confessed that they had been wrong in believing this teaching. Some of them set more dates. October 22 didn't work. Well, let's find another one. But many of them saw validity in the biblical interpretation of the prophecies, and they realized that somehow they had made a mistake, and they continued to study. And finally, they began to understand that the event that was foretold in Daniel 8:14 was not upon this earth. They began to understand and began to read the book of Hebrews and read about an event in heaven called the heavenly sanctuary, and began to understand that the cleansing of the sanctuary foretold in Daniel 8:14 had to do with a heavenly cosmic event that had implications for this earth. October 22, 1844, they discovered was the beginning of the time of the end, when all of these things could happen and final events could commence. And since that time, the main core of Advent believers never ever again set a date for the coming of Jesus. There were dates set, but not the main core of believers. On October 22, 1844, a people got prepared to meet the Lord. But what were they to do? They continued to study, and their attention was drawn to Revelation chapter 10. Daniel and Revelation, they were studying both of them side by side. And their attention was drawn to Revelation chapter 10, a prophecy there concerning a book. A prophecy about a book. Look at verse number 8. John is in vision. He says, "Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, 'Go take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth.'" Here's a prophecy about an open book. The book of Daniel had been a closed book. Daniel 12:4. Daniel had been told to seal the book until the time of the end. And the Millerite believers believed that the book of Daniel had been unsealed and that it was now an open book. They could understand it. And so when they saw this phrase, "Go take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel which stands on the sea and on the earth," and so they interpreted that open book as the book of Daniel that they had been studying. Verse number 9. "So," John says, "I went to the angel and said to him, 'Give me the little book.' And he said to me, 'Take and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth.' Then I, John," he says, "I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter." I believe this is a prophetic, a prophecy foretelling the great disappointment. They had eaten the book of Daniel, and it was so sweet in their mouth, they had preached it. But it had been bitter in their belly. The disappointment in their mouths. So sweet, but so bitter. Well, what then? Verse 11. I think 9 and 10 talk about the experience of our Millerite forefathers 171 years ago. But verse 11 applies to them and to us. And he said to me, you must prophesy again. Different translations will say about or before. I prefer the word before. And he said to me, you must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. No. That's not what it is. They had this bitter disappointment. What do they have to do? Go and preach again. Go and preach again. You must prophesy again before many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. This is their responsibility, and this is our responsibility. To prophesy again, to preach again. Do you believe that Jesus is coming back again? Do you believe it? Then it is your responsibility. It is my responsibility. It is our responsibility to preach again. 171 years. Who would have ever thought it? William Miller and Ellen White and James White and Uriah Smith, none of them would have believed that we would be here in 2015. None of them. And yet we are. And what are we supposed to do? Go out and preach again and again and again until Jesus comes again. I love this passage that song was based upon, written by William Miller. He says, although I have been twice disappointed, I am not yet cast down and discouraged. I have fixed my mind on another time. I have fixed my mind on another time. I know I'm guilty of fixing my mind on other times. I have to have my lecture ready for tomorrow night. That's what's on my mind. That's the time I've fixed in my mind. We all have duties. We all have responsibilities. We have deadlines that occupy our time, occupy our mind. But William Miller understood what was most important. And he says, I have fixed my mind on another time. And here I mean to stand until God gives me more light, until he comes and I see him for whom my soul yearns. I wanted to sing as we close what I consider to be the quintessence